So we're going to segue to the panel discussion on the three networks. And we just heard a superb talk about case studies in Next. And I don't like the high chair, so I'll stand over here. And I was hoping that the others can tell us about the other two networks and highlight some of the active trials. Pooja, would you like to go first about StrokeNet?
Sure. I can try to project, but
that's even better. Okay, great. So StrokeNet was basically developed in 2013. So we're hitting our third 5-year cycle that we're starting now. And basically, it was designed to be the primary infrastructure for multi-center stroke trials. So we're really distinct, as you're going to hear. Like, we were actually phase 2 and 3 for acute prevention and recovery. We're supposed to harness the expertise, and I think we're doing a pretty good job across disciplines. And we actually also encompass pediatric and adult. So we cover a lot of ground. It's really fun. We help develop the proposals. We give advice. We're not gatekeepers. And then we help implement the trials. And as kind of the key of the network, which is all the networks really, are varying portions of like standardization. So we have single IRB, we have standardized contracts, we have standardized payment structures. And then I'll just stop and by saying that we started our last 5-year cycle, we went from 4 to 16 trials, or 18 trials. And then we actually peaked at 21 ongoing trials, and we kind of thought, oh my gosh, it's kind of hitting this point. So things started to close. Right now we are at 15 studies, of which 11 are trials, and we've completed 9 over the course of StrokeNet.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about NET/Siren. So NET was a Neurologic Emergencies Treatment Trials Network that came into initial existence around 2006. So it's one of that was the sort of old school network. One of the first trials it did was Rampart, which was a pre-hospital trial of midazolam versus lorazepam for out-of-hospital status epilepticus in adults and children. And Robert Silverman at Michigan was the contact PI for that. And University of Michigan is the clinical coordinating center. Medical University of South Carolina is the data coordinating center. So that was the first published trial out of our collaboration. We went on to do, one of the other trials that launched at that time was a traumatic brain injury trial called PROTECT, where we looked at progesterone in traumatic brain injury. That trial was neutral. Because there was not a StrokeNet back in that era, we did do a couple acute stroke and TIA trials, including the POINT trial and the SHINE trial, which POINT was of dual antiplatelet therapy, and SHINE was of tight glycemic control in people with acute ischemic stroke. And we became partners in the ALIAS trial, which was ongoing at the time, looking at albumin in acute ischemic stroke as a neuroprotectant. We also became partners in the ATAC-2 trial to help sort of get that to the finish line, which was looking at intensive blood pressure control in intracerebral hemorrhage. We then moved on to do the ESET trial, and one of the things that we got into in the sort of mid to late part of our initial NET era was we got into this unique collaboration where we got some funding from NIH and FDA to do a regulatory science innovation initiative called ADAPT-IT. And in that, us at Michigan, our friends at Medical University of South Carolina, and Roger Lewis and the team at Berry Consultants created a public-private partnership to plan basically for confirmatory phase emergency clinical trials. The charge of the NET was to do confirmatory phase, so practice-changing trials, where the intervention is initiated either in the ambulance or the emergency department. So in contrast to StrokeNet, where you encompass recovery, and also in Next, where you're kind of encompassing conditions that are more chronic progressive, you basically had to have a sudden unexpected condition that brought you to the emergency department, like stroke or status epilepticus. Obviously, stroke fell off our portfolio and fell into and came part of StrokeNet, which was great, and they've been running with that ever since. And it's sort of fun, sort of funny. I did a vascular neurology fellowship. I don't want to make this all about me. So I was doing a lot of. My chair was Bill Barson, who was really one of the forefathers of the net, and had worked on the NINDS-TPA trial. So I was like, oh, I'm doing a lot of stroke research. I was like a co-investigator on some of the trials. Then we got a new chair, Bob Meurer, and he does cardiac arrest research. And then, a lot of our research kind of, we became more collaborators as opposed to the CCC. So then it was kind of convenient that, and cardiac arrest was in the purview of NET/Siren. So I sort of pivoted to doing really big strokes that include all of the brain cardiac arrest. The additional trials that came out of Siren, so Siren came about as NET was reaching its sort of 10-year time period. There was a need to create a new network, and people at NIH wanted there to be a collaboration between National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and NINDS. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute had a prior network called Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium that had been very successful in doing pre-hospital and resuscitation trials, but their funding was ending too. So we all got together to form Siren, which now has neurologic, heart, lung, and blood emergencies as part of its purview. And one of the first studies that we got funded in the Siren era was one of the things that we designed as part of ADAPT-IT, which was IceCap, which is a 1,800 patient, 70-ish center, multi-center trial looking at the optimal duration of hypothermia after cardiac arrest for patients with coma and brain damage. So that was the first trial that we got funded. We also, or I guess that was, and then we also had the Boost 3 trial, which actually I think came slightly earlier, which was looking at brain tissue oxygen monitoring in acute severe traumatic brain injury, and whether that can improve, whether having the information from a brain tissue oxygen sensor versus an ICP monitor alone can help get the clinical teams to take better care and lead to better outcomes for patients. So confirmatory phase trial, a bit more into the ICU, which was okay because it's an urgent intervention that needs to be, it's time sensitive, so it's still within our purview. We have also added pediatric trial, pediatric IceCap, which is a freestanding, completely separate trial that uses very similar methods, and we are also hopefully going to be doing a study looking at ketamine as an adjunctive agent in established status epilepticus. I think compared to, right now we don't have access to the OTA mechanism to do our trial submissions, so when you want to do a study in Siren, you collaborate with us at the CCC and DCC, and we help you with your design. If you have a local statistician, though, that's great, who can do some of the design work. We can work with you, and then we help you work with the network to get your idea sort of vetted through the network in terms of the enthusiasm, but also the logistics and how to do those things. And I think we're looking at studies in acute hypoxic respiratory failure. I know this is mostly a group of neurologists, so like, acute hypoxic respiratory failure, you're like, their CO2 is high. We're not as excited about that, but we're sort of excited about doing that study. We have a sedation study for ventilated patients in the emergency department to optimize outcomes by not over sedating patients that we're working to develop. We, and again, are always looking for additional studies that can influence people with time-sensitive emergencies, and I have a special place in my heart for the neurological emergencies.
That was great. It was very comprehensive. Pooja, maybe you can tell us about the one or two most impactful trials that you feel StrokeNet is.
Yeah, I missed that part of the question, didn't I? So among the completed trials, it's hard. They've all, made a difference. I mean, that's why we do these. And so I guess I would say Diffuse 3, many of you might know, it was one of the 2 trials that launched endovascular therapy beyond 6 hours out to 24 hours to treat acute ischemic stroke with imaging selection. So we're really proud of that. In fact, Greg Albers, who led that trial nationally as the PI, got a congressional award for just how impactful that trial was. One of the ones that is kind of unearthing again that's fun to mention is telerehab, which was actually looking at the non-inferiority of doing rehabilitation by video with sort of a video game approach led by Steve Kramer, and that is now coming back to us as telerehab 2. It got a good score, and you never know these days with the NIH climate, but we're really hopeful that it's going to be actually starting up in the next few months. So yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that for now, maybe. Send it back to you.
Well, that's coming. I can talk about upcoming trials too, but yeah, or ongoing trials.
Yeah, I think a question for the people in the audience is how can young people get involved in these networks? For example, ideas of how it's worked before. We'll start maybe with NINDS.
Yeah, I mean, there's various ways, obviously. I mean, eventually you could submit a proposal, but even beyond that, we've had, more junior investigators get involved as a medical safety monitor in the study. I think that's a good way to kind of see, what's under the hood of clinical trials and get involved at a lower level. If there are ongoing trials in your area, communicating with the PIs to get on the protocol steering committee. If you're at a NeuroNext site, talk to your NeuroNext PI. We try to invite junior investigators to be on protocol working groups when a lot of these are getting designed, where you get to see how the sausage is made, not just see the end product, which I think all are kind of good opportunities. So I think there's a number of different ways. We have NeuroNext fellowships at the NeuroNext sites. Even if you're not a NeuroNext fellow, many of you through the CTMC will get invited to webinars that NeuroNext has that are geared towards, a lot of times junior faculty or things to learn about. I think I would encourage you to try to, attend as many of those as possible to find out. It's kind of what you don't know, and I think the more you can put yourself out there, you'll pick up things that maybe weren't on your radar.
Maybe talk about how you got involved.
I'll hit it personally, and then I'll hit it StrokeNet level. So personally, I was doing my fellowship in a place that had a lot of trials going, and I ended up writing a K-23 off of the IMS3 trial that then allowed me to ask a couple questions related to time and hemorrhage and how it relates to reperfusion, and also lashed on a practical role of being the internal medical monitor. So I was reviewing the safety events and preparing them for the independent medical monitor. And I'll throw out just a few other kind of multi-dimensional things that if you really like trials, I think they're so fun, is joining your local IRB. At least ours is always looking for more people with stroke expertise. And actually something that people don't always know about, you can actually apply to be on an FDA panel. There's an application you can put in. I did that very early in my career and was on a standing FDA advisory panel, and since then do ad hoc ones. So a lot of opportunities like that. And kind of thinking big picture StrokeNet, I do want to mention that on our website, if you just put in NIH StrokeNet, we actually have StrokeNet trainees that are funded, one for each regional coordinating center, so there's 27 of them every year. And they may or may not have this training as part of their ACGMA fellowship. Some are even mid-career faculty. And they have learning groups and lecture series, and all the lecture series are public, including professional development talks and stuff. So something to keep in mind. But I'll say two more things. One is that we do try to maintain a level of autonomy for the person running their trial. We provide a strong support, but everybody, we all want to do this together. It's so much teamwork, right? So in general, if you have a trial that would reach the point of being multi-center StrokeNet trial, then typically people who are early in their careers in terms of trials will have a multiple PI who's sort of card carrying and kind of show the road, because we don't have that much infrastructure for running the trial within StrokeNet beyond kind of big picture guidance and support. And then the second thing I'll say is we now have an OTA mechanism, which we're super excited about. We've partnered with the Berry consultants to design the STEP platform, which is basically allowing us to ask multiple questions as assets and domains And these multiple questions can kind of come in and out, and because it's an OTA, it doesn't have that protracted peer review. It allows us to work with industry, but it also allows us to work with junior people, because in that setting, we're actually writing this together very much as multiple PIs. So just something else to keep in mind. The STEP platform is focused on patients with ischemic stroke who have any visualized occlusion, but I'll say that we're kind of thinking bigger than that in terms of recovery, cognition. So if that hits any of your worlds, keep that in mind.
Okay. I wanted to add one thing to what Pooja said, if it's okay. She mentioned the advisory panels. I would also say, volunteering, or if you're asked, say yes to be on a study section, particularly a clinical trial study section. I think my personal opinion is you can take 25 of the university-sponsored how to write a grant courses, and it won't teach you nearly as much as sitting through one clinical trial study section, where you will really learn not so much what to do, but what not to do when you're writing a grant. I think if you want to learn how to write a good grant, go to a study section.
I will.
I just have to say one thing, because I always feel so happy about this, but the PRISMS trial, which has since been published, was actually developed at this course. So taking this course is part of your trajectory.
I would also sort of echo, there's a new program, or relatively new program, for sort of like early career peer reviewers, and people get kind of embedded into the panels. In the past, it often like an RO1 or equivalent was sort of like the quote unquote bar for entry, but that has been recognized as sort of severely limiting, particularly for people who may be doing really good team science and being co-investigators or local site PIs on clinical trials. So that's an opportunity that there is an application process through CSR to do. I would completely agree with Chris, like seeing the inside of a study section lets you know a lot about those things. I will say there is also, clinical trials are fun, they're impactful. They're team sports though, so there is a balance in terms of your career, in terms of how much you need to accomplish to sort of have a body of work, depending on how your promotions and tenure committees work. I'm not saying you shouldn't do the right step for what's next to make patients better, and a lot of, like I have never been a PI by myself on any grant. I've always been on an MPI type plan. I guess maybe like smaller like career development grants like way back. But so it's always a team sport, but there's always this sort of tension, in terms of your mentorship from your chair and people locally. It would be, it can be very hard to do sort of like a K23 and then use that as preliminary data to do a trial. A lot of the really successful K23s capitalize on data that exists, like in IMS3, like, as opposed to like, you were going to generate new pilot data to do a trial. Those things can be very high risk in that K23 space. And that's not to mean that you should lose hope, but things that may be more palatable or sort of, whether they're cohort studies, but a lot of times having access to people who have robust data sets that are in your disease space are helpful. I think one of the other important things is, as best you can, if you can be in the right place at the right time, that's super helpful. But unfortunately, it's not easily replicable. But I think in our network in Siren, we recognize that there have been a few people who've been at the right place in the right time, and they've gotten, like myself, I was in terms of the planning, I was like a glorified note taker in the Adaptive grant, and then they ended up putting me in charge of one of the trials. You heard Jadeep last night, who was like, I wasn't really looking to be the clinical trial PI here, but everybody said I would be really good at this. So I think some of it is being in the right place at the right time, but listening to those opportunities and trying to understand if they're good opportunities. That can be really helpful. And we, as more senior investigators, I think it's very routine for our data coordinating center colleagues to put space on their grants for graduate students so that they can teach the PhD students how to be clinical trial biostatisticians. And I think on our large clinical trial grants, at least we in Siren haven't been good enough by having like a 10% effort for clinical coordinating center, clinician to be named. We've been trying to do that in some of the projects we've been developing. We've brought in one of our pulmonary critical care fellows in our acute hypoxic respiratory failure study, and she has developed a ton of preliminary data that has been really helpful to the grant, although she's going to be on the K23, so she can't be a clinical PI on it, but we're trying to get the right people in the room with some funding to help move their careers forward. So trying to think about those opportunities, but I think that idea of being an independent medical monitor, those sorts of roles are really helpful.
I almost forgot to mention also site PIs. Like I was the site PI. I think my first trial I was ever site PI for was Alias, and then you're there and you're learning how the network's working. It's an incredible learning.
Well, the only other thing I'd say is the other advantage of study section, especially now that they're starting to be in person again, has nothing to do with study section itself. But one of the things I got the most out of, especially when I started doing neurology study section, was the networking that takes place at the dinner that often takes place if it's a 2-day study section between. That's where you'll meet people that you'll end up using those connections, for years. So there's like scientific and non-scientific advantages, but there are advantages to networking and getting to know people who you will run across at later points in your career.
I just wanted to say, as a co-chair of a promotion and tenure committee, that networking is super important because you'll need some arm's length letters in order to go up for a promotion, and often through committees and study sections and other groups you can find people in the field who are in a high level. I have one more question, and I'll open it up to the audience, but what would you like to see added to your networks in the future? Either trials, ideas, etc.
So I won't say that, I feel that there's a couple glaring things that are missing from siren studies right now, I would say. And nobody in this room is going to be super excited probably, but I really think we need to have an asthma study. I think we need to have a study in sickle cell. I think though, in terms of the neuro space, spinal cord injury, I think is something we've been trying to get a project going in for a while, and we haven't. I think that's quite important. I think there is a variety of potential improvement in other acute neurologic syndromes. We are working on a migraine study, including a headache/migraine study, because in the emergency department we can't always tell whether it's really quote unquote pure migraine or not. But we're looking at a occipital nerve blockade for that, which I really think that would be important and could be impactful, because a lot of people suffering from headache come to our emergency departments. I think having something where we look at some of the optimization of pre-hospital care for a variety of neurologic conditions, in terms of TBI, status epilepticus, cardiac arrest, brain injury. Those are things that I would love to have coming into the network. I think also certain other things like meningitis, where we, because it's a rare disease, we do not see enough of it. We haven't generated a lot of new data in terms of acute meningitis versus encephalitis treatment and diagnosis in a while. So I think that's something else that I think is within the sort of siren purview, something that we often don't think about doing because it's hard, because it's it's dispersed. But with having many centers across the country, those are the sorts of resources we could study those rare diseases. So I think those are a few of the things that there's probably other things I would like to see. I'm sorry if I didn't mention your disease, if it can occur emergently to people. I really want to study that too. Anyway.
I think from the neuromech side, it's kind of a hard question to answer, in the sense that because we cover such a wide range of diseases, one of the challenges we have is the network can't necessarily solicit ideas easily, and that we want to avoid any perception of playing favorites with any particular disease based on leadership of the network and so forth. So we try to stay out of that somewhat. In terms of broad, there is a desire to get more pediatric studies, right, regardless of the disease in the network. We're open to both adult and pediatric studies, but there have been way more adult proposals that have come through than pediatric proposals, and so that's definitely kind of a focus of moving forward. The gene therapy, which is now coming into NeuroNext, trying to get that going. The other thing that's a big focus, not so much on the disease side within NeuroNext, and I think this is probably true of all the networks and really across NINDS and NIH, is trying to make sure more proactively that we're setting up our trials to be reflective of the disease population. So we have a new DEI committee in neuronex and trying to kind of do a better job of getting a sense of what is the disease breakdown, as far as, demographics go, and monitoring the trials to make sure that they're representative. And that's become increasingly emphasized across NIH with something within the network that we're starting to pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah, if you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said we need more pilot trials and more recovery trials. I think we're going in the right direction there. One thing that's sort of brewing is this idea of maybe now doing a recovery platform. So that's in discussion. I'll mention that we've been charged with creating priority setting conferences that are going to be open to the public for any of you who touch stroke. We're currently working as a network to decide a theme or two for these conferences, and the plan is it'll be hybrid and open and include stakeholders and hopefully provide sort of that public-driven, kind of initiatives that then you can quote and say, everyone thinks I should do this trial. And I guess I'll just mention, DEI, we had a DEI advisory committee that's been elevated to a core that we're so pleased about, led by Leslie Scalaris and Bernadette Abimbola. And we see a real opportunity there. I would say what I'd really like to see soon is more pragmatic trials. We've been having a lot of discussions about that and building some educational programming around that to help energize that. Because as we know well, NIH dollars only go so far. The funding climate's pretty tough right now, and there are some, more kind of cost-efficient ways to answer questions. So I think those are some of the things off the top of my head. There's always a lot to do.
So now we're hoping to have questions from the audience. Does anybody have any burning question related to any of these? If not, I can keep asking questions.
I think I can project. So I'm always interested in ways to leverage placebo groups, and I wonder if there are mechanisms that you can think of to sort of bring together investigators who have questions in similar disease states that you might see some innovative trial design with multi-arm, and one placebo group, and that could apply to any of the networks. Just in terms of things that would help move our fields forward, is that something that people have appetite for?
Absolutely. I mean, we are actually thrilled by those designs and only trying to get more and more in that direction. So the MOST trial, which just got completed and will be published in a very major journal in the next month, was a multi-arm, multi-stage design, one placebo arm, and then argatroban and defibitide as the other two arms to try to enhance IV thrombolysis, led by Okwe, Adeoye, and colleagues. So, and we saw that as only the beginning, and that STEP platform very much so is kind of based on that idea that we can get a lot of efficiency by having domains where there's a placebo arm and then multiple, mutually exclusive assets that we want to test. So we're hoping there's going to be a really nice neuroprotection domain, for example.
I hope we can move towards that. I think the traditional way of reviewing grants, not that I'm bitter about a pre-hospital multi-arm study that I submitted a couple times, was that one of the challenges in the traditional grant review process is that if you put the more, as your number of agents and arms increases, the likelihood that you're going to find one of the reviewers who utterly hates one and is just going to give you straight sevens, goes up. Like with, so if you're like, we're going to start with 3, you have about 30% chance of somebody just giving you straight sevens because they just hate that agent, even if the agent's just as good as the other agents. Which is why I think the new way of looking at things through the OTA mechanism and having a slightly less death panel approach to evaluating our science will hopefully move those things forward. I think particularly in diseases where there's a little bit more dispersed sort of enrollment, where you need to have collaboration across sites. I think, Berry Consultants has done a lot of work in the idea of platform trials and master protocols. I think setting things up so that, there's the Healy ALS platform that was funded by philanthropy, but is run out of MGH, which is I think a really great example of a way of doing that in a progressive neurologic condition. So I think I think the challenge is sort of having the right set of special sauces, so to speak, some idea of like the right funders to build the infrastructure, because you need the building, but then which is why you hopefully, whether that's a mechanism through NIH or a foundation, if you build the mechanism, but you also know that you've lined up a variety of good agents that can come into this platform. Because if you're like, if you have 3 or 4 agents, that's great, but then what happens after that? Because then you're going to want to keep the thing going and keeping it as a discovery engine. Or if you find one thing that works, then you start adding the other things to that thing and see if they have biologically sort of coherent potential for combination. So I think the question of how to do it is sort of hard. I guess I would say like looking at the examples where there's been some success, like Healy ALS and the stroke step platform, I think, and how those could be generalized to other conditions, I think would be the way to go. Does anybody who's like really smart about platform designs want to say anything else? Raj?
No, obviously the peanut gallery in the back here we were just talking about the fact that the idea of leveraging placebos and trying to work collaboratively so that we minimize the number of patients required to answer the important questions is obviously a goal we should all support. I think your comments about the dynamics of study section, I'm not sure I've heard Death Panel used in that way, but I like it. Sometimes runs counter to science being conducted in the way that actually is the most efficient. And I think that's just an existing dynamic in the way we fund, especially publicly funded science. But of course, that approach also has a lot of benefits in the sense that it does allow for independent review of the things that, as Chris mentioned earlier, our tax dollars get spent to support. So I'm not sure we want to move completely to the model that's used in industry, which is that small numbers of people make decisions about very large amounts of money. But we also have had to deal with the downsides of the sort of panel approach to the review of science. That said, what I think seems to be happening is that as there are more and more successes with publicly funded platform trials and modifications to our existing systems of both review and funding that lead to success, like the OTA mechanism, like the fact that now multiple NIH institutes are actively pursuing platform trial approaches because they want to leverage their dollars as efficiently as possible, just like industry does. What we're seeing is the system shift in the right direction. So for the students who have, their, in many cases, most or all of their career ahead of them, this is exactly the kind of trial design you want to gain experience with and try to get a foot in the door, even if it's, as Will said, you're just a note taker in a meeting. Because I think 10 years from now or 15 years from now, the advantages of the efficient approach to answering multiple questions simultaneously will have taken over very large swaths of science because it's just going to be more efficient, and it's actually going to be more patient-centered because we minimize the number of patients who are necessarily receiving standard of care simply to provide a comparison group against therapies that we hope will be more effective.
And since I still have the microphone, I don't want to like turn this into like a statistical Jerry Springer show, but one kind of major issue is the most common statistical technique in clinical trials over the years has been comparing two groups using some sort of null hypothesis frequentist test. And for this idea of a platform trial where you're sort of sharing across multiple groups and using a shared control, you do need more sophisticated approaches. And that's, I think I will leave it at that so that nobody throws a chair at me or anything. But that's historically been, and it's not just historic. I mean, depending on where you are, what your institution is, and what the people you collaborate with have had experience doing, you may not have expertise immediately available to you locally to do those sorts of things. And again, in many clinical trials groups, whether publicly funded or industry funded, that method of approaching a trial design is still quite common. Lori. I need to move or else my cats will seize.
I was just going to echo a little bit of what Roger said and also what you said. And I've had the privilege of being a co-chair for the Recover Long COVID Clinical Trials Steering Committee, which I say privilege with in quotes. But if you think about long COVID and how little we know about it and how all the symptoms kind of cluster, it's not like one person gets this and one person gets that. I see Amy kind of smiling back there. It has been amazing to watch them develop these platform trials that can cross-fertilize actually at the end. So it's, I've been dismayed and impressed all at the same time at how complicated it is and how thoughtful people have been at trying to use the money efficiently and answer as many questions as possible in potentially as clean a way as possible. But it gets so complicated. As someone who grew up in the era of, compare this to this, it's been a huge learning curve for me.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I think there was one of the silver linings of COVID was exactly what Lori was saying, these Operation Warp Speed, OTA mechanism, COVID platform trials. In fact, StrokeNet got brought in to be one of the network of networks doing, active 4A and 4C, which were looking at antithrombotics in COVID-infected patients. So that's all to say, I just want to reinforce this point that Will is making, which is these adaptive designs are the future, and that you should be investing your time. Depending on the level of experience of your local statisticians, they may steer you towards the simple one-to-one, but I always kind of quote actually Roger back there and say, you don't want to have regrets about, were you better off picking one agent versus another. So kind of think broader, but then I'll say the other thing is that to do that, you do need that support, which you're here, so you're getting some of that support, because doing that back-end work to develop these trials is a lot of work, particularly for your statistical colleagues. So that's just something else to keep in mind.
Yeah, so I'll say a word. So first of all, let me preface this by saying I'm a huge fan of platform trials, and I agree with everything that's been said. To give a bit of a counterpoint, though, I do think there are lots of advantages of platform trials that have been said. I think one of the things that we have to be cautious with as a field is it doesn't just become the sexy, shiny new toy and everybody tries to squeeze everything into a platform trial, which does a disservice more than a service. I think they're not easy to implement. They need to be thought through, they need to have clear objectives, and they need to have a clear sense of how you're going to analyze that and the infrastructure in place. And I feel like they're kind of becoming almost like the hot thing, everybody wants to do one, and if you haven't thought it through and you haven't got the right people doing it, it will end up doing it. What's going to happen, I suspect, in the next 5 years, one's going to go horribly wrong because they're going to put one in place that some group's going to put one in place that doesn't know what they're doing, and it's horrible and it's going to cause lots of problems. And those of us who like it and like to do it right are going to have to basically defend it again for that. I mean, it happens with everything. Everything becomes like the hot thing, what to do. So I would just caution that to try to make sure you're connecting with the right people. And one of the questions, whether it's a platform trial, adaptive design of any kind, and this has been talked about for years, the first question, if that comes up, is do we need to do this? If you don't add complexity to a trial that you don't need complexity to. If you do it right.
Yeah, and I do want to say early in your career, a platform trial is not what you should be writing, but we're talking, but adaptive trials, on the other hand, that's where it's worth thinking about.
Sorry, can I add one thing? Sorry.
Yeah, you go for it. I'm not going to walk all the way back there.
Yeah, it's, I'm going to say, first of all, I agree 110% with what Chris just said. I think that there's a couple of different kinds of efficiency that we're talking about. One of them is just a master protocol, which is not a statistical statistical innovation. It's simply trying to standardize the way you do something within, for example, a network. And since this is a session on network, the standardization of enrollment procedures, data collection, databases, the other infrastructure pieces have a huge amount of advantages in terms of efficiency that have nothing to do with whether the statistical inference is just A versus B, one-to-one randomization, fixed sample size. So I just want to be clear that we're sort of talking maybe a little bit loosely about a couple of different things, and those innovations are huge, and that can often be the majority of the efficiency gain in the way platform trials are done. Actually has nothing to do with the platform design, it has to do with the machinery around it. Anything you can do to get yourself embedded in or learning from or hanging out with people who are doing those sorts of large, efficient activities, I think will be generally good for your career and your sanity and your resiliency in your academic pursuits. When we talk about platform trials, we're talking about a statistical innovation that has multiple active treatments and control group, lots of complexity. All of Chris's comments are relevant, and those are things for which there are a very specific set of circumstances where they have advantages, and they're not for the faint of heart.
So I would sort of say, can I say something first? I mean, I don't know, people hear me talk a lot, but I think more to the question though, sometimes the early phase trials, like getting 5 centers together and doing data use agreements, doing a single IRB and all that, if you don't, you have to go through funding, you have to do that. If you have an idea that's a little bit more early and you have some local resources and you have 4 friends at other institutions who have little local resources, coming up with a common protocol where you are all sort of submitting it locally, doing your single site things, but doing some sort of estimation question, like what proportion of the patient, that has a huge proof of concept thing, like what proportion of the patients are responding to this agent, how much does that look different from what we expect from standard care rates, and then having a pre-planned way of combining that aggregate data. I just feel like sometimes I'm in just data use agreement hell, the amount of time and effort it would take for me to set something up where those 4 other sites send data to me. I could spend all that effort, we could just do the trial at each site if we just sort of cribbed each other's protocol and just submitted it at each of our places, and then just did a combination where we narrowed our confidence intervals by combining our estimates from our 4 sites. So that's not something I've seen done a lot, but it seems like because of all of these additional they're not bad barriers, they're just barriers, and you're like, well, it's going to take a lot of effort to organize 5 sites. But in that can really be done at the investigator level, and then everybody sort of decentralizes it and brings it back together at the end. So that's another possible model that's a little like that, because it's daunting, right? You're like, to do this phase 2 trial, I need to get an R01, but they're not going to submit an R01 because they don't feel like this is an R01-able idea. Not that you can get R01s from NINDS for clinical trials. They have different mechanisms. It's all UH, even the small ones are UH3, UG3. Maybe there's, so there's some, multi-center. It's very hard to do multi-center for an R01.
At least, I'll just say this,
At least in stroke, if you're less than 5, like roughly 5 sites, and it's a simple, that we've got several R01s in the stroke field right now that are trials, so.
All right, Dan.
Yeah, that's great. I just want to say that everyone's a new investigator to your mind, and it may seem like these things are pie in the sky, out of your reach, things like that, but that seemed that big to me when I wrote my first R01. It seemed like Pooja and all of us who wrote our first R01s. Everyone's a new investigator, so you're not, but thinking about these kinds of things, it may feel out of reach, but it's not as out of reach as you might think. But pairing with people who know how to do it, that networking, that understanding, so forth, things like that, way, all those things you're hearing about, wow, those are things I need to manage, right? Platform trials, things like that. There's so few of them because they're so hard to write. But understanding that as a goal is kind of what I hope you guys are taking away, because I was really intimidated by what you guys were saying. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a hard time writing some of those things that you're saying about. But again, you're new investigators, so you're not. Think about the steps. Don't be afraid of that vision. I would love for every trainee in this room to take their protocols you're working on now and submit it to one of these networks as an idea. They will give you feedback on the idea, things like that, and help you move that forward, even if you don't end up taking that particular project into R01.
Dan, thank you for that. That summarized the situation in the room very well. And I was wondering, does anyone else have any burning questions? If not, everyone's available during office hours and just speak with us directly. So, yes.
Very quick question. Am I the only one who's never heard of an OTA? What does that mean? Does that just mean no study section?
No.
Great question, we should have penciled that out.
Do you guys want, Jennifer, do you want to take it? I can try if you want me to, or.
We'll go for one step in.
So I had never heard of it until recently either, but so other transactional authority is something that is set in place where it gives NIH a little more discretion than the typical study section process. It still requires review. It's a review that looks and smells like a study section, but it's not a study section. There is no summary statement. There's nothing formal, but it's basically review comments that go to the institute, who can then take that and decide where to go. And it can be multiple stages. I think EpicNet has 3, NeuroNext will have 2. I don't know, do yours have 2? The 2 stages.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, the 2 stages where we're in the first stage, it's just the question and the concept, and if there's interest, then like a second stage to put in a full protocol application.
Yeah. So and then it's a rolling application. So then they can get groups together. That the advantage of that, I think from our side, why we're excited about it, is the stage 1 reviews the scientific premise. So it only really comes to the network if the science is deemed good, right? It doesn't get into the details of the study. It's more high level details, but not the nitty gritty of it. It's more, is the science good to go to that. So it's a more efficient way of moving things through, which I think is helpful to those of you in here, but also, at least from the NeuroNext side, was a way to try to get industry interested in coming in. The timelines of the typical grant process are not attractive to industry at all. And so, I don't know, do you guys did I do a decent job of this?
You did a great job, Chris, yeah. And I'll just say, we're really excited about it because I think, as you said, Chris, one of the big advantages is that it will allow us to provide, we're hoping it will allow us, it will still go through a peer review process that, as Chris said, will look very similar to the ones that you all have been talking about, but we'll be able to do that much faster and give you feedback, and you won't have to wait for another cycle to pass. So we're hopeful for that.
And the network's spent a lot of work. Basically you have to build the entire plans to the Death Star basically for your project, even an IND and everything, and then you get kind of there's questions regarding the significance of the question and so forth. So I think this idea of this stage is you can get that significant step looked at before the networks put a ton of time and effort into building out the whole protocol and other regulatory submissions. So I think that's a great advance. I think sort of drawing the pretty picture of this is what we need a trial in, and making sure that's okay before, and then putting the resources into designing after that has passed that initial step.
And it has a numeric score, like in the review it gets a numeric score, but I don't think the numeric score is as important as it is in the typical grant. It's more this red light approach, which we're starting to use in some study section of it now, but it's the green, yellow, red, which is really the main, I think, feedback, where green means this looks good. Yellow means this could be good, but needs some changes, in red is kind of no-go. I think that feedback to NIH is kind of helpful. Jennifer, you like it?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing about, it is a peer review, it's an independent, objective review, conflict of interest, all of that is, taken into account. But one thing that is quite different is consensus is not required. So we're going to get those the feedback from the individual reviewers. So it's going to take away that, to some degree, that influence of one person kind of throwing the whole thing off, which I think is a significant difference between the two from a review perspective.